my name is Dr. Thomas Duvall, and I am the moderator for this Macon-Bibb County Bicentennial lecture called History of Macon-Bibb, Race, Ethnicity, and Culture. And I have with me our 5-person panel who will share with you their research on topic, and they are Dr. Matt Jennings. He is the professor of history at Middle Georgia State University. He has researched Native American history of the mounds at the Ocmulgee Mounds National Historic Park here in Middle Georgia. He has taught early African American history and colonial American history. We also have Ms. Muriel M. Jackson, head of the Genealogical and Historical Room at the Middle Georgia Regional Library. She is our walking, talking encyclopedia of Middle Georgia history here in Macon, Georgia. She is my personal resource for African American history. And basically, if Ms. Jackson can't find it in the library and she can't tell you where you can find it, well, you're in a heap of trouble. We also have Sergeant Lonnie Davis, retired Master Sergeant from the United States Army. He is also a retired Ocmulgee Mounds Park Ranger. He has researched and produced a wonderful book with the names of the African American soldiers called the African Brigade. We also have Dr. Thelma Dillard. She hails from an extensive local African American family here in Macon, Middle Georgia. She has extensive involvement in the local civil rights movement, especially here in the Bibb County Public School system. Dr. Dillard is a former NAACP president and a former Macon City Council person. She is currently president of the Bibb County School Board. We have Dr. Dunaway, Professor Emeritus of French and Interdisciplinary Studies at Mercer University. Dr. Dunning founded the Beloved Community Symposium in 2005. Now that you have met them, let's get started with their presentations.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Jennings. I teach history at Middle Georgia State University. First, thanks to Dr. Duvall and my fellow presenters. It's an honor to be included in the company of people I've looked up to for many years. I've been tasked with telling the story of Macon's indigenous people from the 1820s to the present to mark our town's bicentennial. And I've decided to expand my chronology somewhat since most of this region's history predates Macon. For more than 10,000 years, communities of varying shapes and sizes have called the Ocmulgee River Valley home. Pictured here, in a photograph taken by John Legg, a former student of mine, are some examples of the monumental architecture of the Mississippians, who built an impressive town at the river's eastern shore about 1,000 years ago and are among the ancestors of today's Muskogee Creek Nation. Later Muskogee speakers would explain that this place, Ocmulgee, was where they first sat down or constituted themselves as a nation. Ocmulgee itself is a Hitchiti word that translates into English as bubbling or boiling waters. In addition to the iconic platform mounds, Mississippians built circular houses, several of which were excavated in the early 20th century. The most recognizable of these is the so-called Earth Lodge. Likely constructed just under 1,000 years ago, the council house on the Macon Plateau is within a few inches of being a perfect circle. It features a platform in the shape of a bird of prey, which many Mississippians revered, with space on the body for 3 elite individuals, perhaps a principal chief, second chief, and speaker or singer. The bird's wings extend around the chamber's walls and would have provided seating for up to 47 more leaders who deliberated the main issues of the day. Twice yearly, the sun's rays shone down the long entry passage and illuminated the platform. Native societies were dynamic. not static, and were and are continuously reshaping themselves to deal with a changing world. Descendants of the Mississippians were on hand to meet the first European attempts to colonize the interior of the Southeast, those of the Spanish in the 1500s, and descendants of those descendants alternately confronted the threats and seized the opportunities presented by the English, who founded Carolina in 1670 and Georgia in 1733. Muskogees would continue this pattern in the late 18th century as they confronted Americans' voracious appetite for indigenous land. In this imaginative 20th century postcard, Native people and white people come together in the shadow of Fort Hawkins, built in the first decade of the 19th century. Though most Muskogee towns were located west of what is now Macon at this point, the people continued to honor their ancestral homelands and held on to them in treaty after treaty until the 1820s. While installations like Hawkins could be sites of peaceful interaction, we must not lose sight of the fact that they also represented the leading edge of American empire, which would stop at nothing to extinguish native land title. From the time the Okmulgee site came into their possession in the 1820s until it was protected as Okmulgee National Monument in the 1930s, white Maconites did not revere or honor this place's history. Some of the monuments survived as objects of curiosity or eventually as places to race motorcycles, but others were destroyed in the quest for profit or in the name of progress. A wide variety of economic activity took place at Okmulgee. Cotton agriculture, ever dependent on slavery, took center stage until the Civil War. In the later 19th and early 20th centuries, Okmulgee was home to a dairy farm, a clay mining operation and brick factory, and a railroad roundhouse. In the 1840s and again in the 1870s, rail lines tore through the area, causing irreparable damage and resulting in the displacement of sacred objects and, more distressingly, human remains. The 1930s brought sweeping change to Okmulgee. A community-wide effort led by Walter Harris, an attorney and World War I general, Lenton Solomon, and C.C. Harold resulted in the acquisition of almost 700 acres of land. This land was then placed under the stewardship of the federal government, and Okmulgee National Monument was born in 1936. President Roosevelt called attention to the old Okmulgee fields, upon which certain Indian mounds of great historical significance are located. Even before the official creation of the National Monument, a small handful of trained archaeologists and hundreds of Works Progress Administration workers had been engaged in what was at the time the largest archaeological dig in the United States. Though later archaeologists would call into question many of the methods used in the 1930s, these excavations form the basis of much of what we know about the region's indigenous history. Construction also began on a visitor center and museum at this time. World War II intervened, work at Okmulgee ceased, and the museum remained a mostly empty shell. In the very late 1940s, work began again on the museum and visitor center, and the facility officially opened in 1951. Macon was now home to a world-class showcase for Native American history and a cutting-edge archaeological laboratory. It was, according to some of its accompanying materials, the largest and most modern national park museum east of the Mississippi River. Its architecture combined the Art Moderne style in vogue in the 1930s with some nods to the site's Mississippian past in the decorative application of Lamar bold-incised pottery patterns to the exterior. Not everybody loved the museum's design. One critic memorably referred to the supremely ugly museum at Georgia's Okmulgee National Monument and suggested that its appearance might be improved by building a mound over it. Thankfully, the National Park Service ignored that advice. In a talk intended to cover Native American history in Macon from the 1820s to the present, it may seem odd that Native people themselves have been largely absent so far. That's a testament to how thoroughly efforts to deport Muskogees from the Southeast in the 19th century were, and to how poorly most non-Native people in the region understand what happened next. Native nations forced out of the Southeast did not simply vanish. Rather, they continued ancient traditions and built new ones in Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. The process was not simple and it was not painless, but the people eventually built their nations and flourished. Among the honored guests at the museum's opening in 1951 were dozens of Muskogee citizens. Here, Annie and Lewis Taylor and young Arnold Taylor examined the Master Farmer, or Mississippian, sculpture. From the 1950s onward, delegations of Muskogees and associated communities would continue to visit Macon to deepen their connection with their ancestors' homelands and to educate Maconites. In 1951 and 52, they participated in large festivals. In 1951, torrential rains forced many of the planned outdoor activities inside the Macon City Auditorium, where these dancers enlightened and entertained a large crowd. By the 1950s, Native American dance, while still rooted in local and regional traditions, had also evolved to reflect the broad influence of powwow culture, with its competitive prizes, stunning regalia, and often acrobatic artistry. The text which originally accompanied this photograph notes that at least one of the dancers pictured was a national champion. In what must have been one of the crowning moments of his long life, General Walter Harris was on hand to greet the Creek delegations that visited Macon in the early 1950s. Here, Creek painter A.C. Blue Eagle presents Harris with a blanket. Blue Eagle was a fascinating and multi-talented man. He worked as a children's television show host, a college professor, and an artist. As an artist, he adapted traditional Native American styles in painting, sculpture, and ceramics to new uses, some of them brazenly commercial. He could trade in and even delight in stereotypical portrayals of Native Americans, but he could also serve as an insightful cultural ambassador. Of his time in Macon, he noted that it was truly marvelous to visit the land of my ancestors, and that the celebration was a more wonderful thing than the people of Macon realize, since it might dispel the feeling that a few of the Creeks still hold of hate and resentment. The stickball game has deep roots in many southeastern Native communities, though not every nation plays by exactly the same rules. The game evolved as a preparation for, or in some cases as a substitute for, combat, and retained some of its rough-and-tumble attributes into the 20th century. Rain plagued the 1951 celebration, as noted, but it didn't prevent members of the Hicks and Asbury families from demonstrating the freewheeling sport inside the confines of the city auditorium. The 1952 festival also witnessed a stickball contest, this time between Creeks and Cherokees. The event lived up to its violent billing as the Creeks won handily, and 3 players ended up being treated and released from a local hospital. While Maconites may have respected Muskogees enough to invite them to the museum's opening celebration and subsequent festivals, that generosity of spirit did not extend to the human remains exhumed at the site. Skeletal remains had been on display in the vicinity of the trading post and the funeral mound for decades, before finally being removed from public view in the 1960s. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which became law in 1990, requires federally supported entities to consult with tribes on these sensitive matters. While several sets of remains and associated artifacts have been returned to the Muskogee Nation and eventually to the earth, the process of repatriation is ongoing. The Muskogee Creek Nation was reborn in the 1970s. Representatives drafted a new constitution, and for the first time in a long time, Muskogees could select their own leaders without the approval of federal officials. For principal chief, they chose Claude Cox, a towering figure in modern Muskogee history. Cox viewed the connection between Okmulgee, the governmental center in the Creek Nation, and Okmulgee, the sacred site in Middle Georgia, as spiritually and economically vital to the present and future of the Muskogee people. Cox and other Muskogees sought to build upon the groundwork laid by the 1950s delegations and to empower Muskogees to sell native-produced goods at Okmulgee and the I-75 rest stop just north of town. Cox noted that Macon was on the main thoroughfare to Florida and Disney World. Muskogees found willing partners in Maconite Charles H. Jones and Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, both of whom traveled to the Creek Nation at various points. Principal Chief Cox is pictured here with his wife Lily Sims Big Pond Cox and Macon Mayor Ronnie Thompson. Jones and Cox's plans also involved convincing young Native people to move from Oklahoma to Macon. Eventually, several did so. They were predominantly Creek, though Cherokees, Choctaws, and Uchis participated too. The young people worked as interpreters at Okmulgee. Here's Ben Chakota at the Earth Lodge, took classes at local colleges, reveled in dispelling stereotypes, though that could prove difficult in the face of bombastic celebrations like 1972's Creek Week, which commemorated the 150th anniversary of Bibb County's founding and promised to turn the Trail of Tears into a Trail of Cheers. Eventually, most of the young people grew disillusioned and moved elsewhere, including back to Oklahoma. Some of them, such as Peggy Chakota, expressed the sentiment that they had been used by local whites. Gerald Harjo, who had given Charles H. Jones a start at a dinner party by suggesting that Macon return land to the Creeks, remained in Macon for years, teaching art and history at Central High School. The Creek Indian Trading Post opened to great fanfare in 1972. Gerald and Wayne Harjo danced in regalia, Ben Chakota drummed, and Pinky Webster sang before a crowd that some observers estimated at 2,000 people. Various Muskogee and U.S. federal dignitaries gave brief speeches. The Post, which sold Creek-produced arts and crafts as well as more general Native American fare, was managed by John Moore, a Creek Master Sergeant who had retired after 3 decades' service in the Army. Moore was assisted in his endeavors by Addie George, a remarkable Yuchi woman who was just beginning her long personal involvement with Okmulgee. She and her daughter Valerie would continue to visit Okmulgee for years. At the time of her death in 2006, at age 94, Miss Addie was one of the very few people fluent in Yuchi. She'd be pleased to know that Yuchi children are now being taught the language by elders through the Yuchi Language Project. Every September since 1991, save for 2020 and 2021, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, dozens of Native American performers, crafters, and storytellers have come to Okmulgee to take part in the Okmulgee Indigenous, formerly Indian, celebration, hosted by the Okmulgee Mounds Association and the National Park Service. Many, though by no means all, of the participants represent southeastern nations. While the size of the Creek delegation varies from year to year, the people's continued presence at the event signifies their lasting commitment to Okmulgee. The event also provides opportunities for Native vendors to reach a market which they might otherwise find difficult to access. In some years, as many as 20,000 guests have attended the celebration, making it one of Macon's largest events and one of the largest Native gatherings in the Southeast. The success owes a great deal to the efforts of Sylvia Flowers, a ranger who worked tirelessly to connect Okmulgee to its Creek past in a variety of ways, including a cultural ambassadors program that brought Native speakers to Macon in the mid-1990s. In the 1980s and 1990s, the relationship between the Muskogee Creek Nation and Okmulgee National Monument, and even the park itself, came under serious pressure, as a proposed road project threatened the monument and associated cultural sites. For some time, regional transportation authorities had toyed with the idea of a fall-line freeway that would run from Columbus to Augusta. As those plans became more clearly defined in the 1990s, it appeared as the proposed route through Macon, known as the Eisenhower Parkway Extension, would run perilously close to the boundaries of Okmulgee National Monument and risk damaging sacred lands and as yet undocumented archaeological sites. Local activists, including the dentist Lindsay Doc Holliday, sprang into action to pressure officials to change the route. The Muskogee Creek and other Native nations weighed in against the proposed route, which was eventually set aside in light of cultural and economic considerations. In 2012, in front of what was likely at that point the largest delegation of Creeks at Okmulgee since the early 19th century, Muskogee Creek Nation Principal Chief George Tiger told a story that had been passed down through the generations of Creeks in Oklahoma. It is said that our forefathers and foremothers, as they were preparing to make a trip to an unknown land, had a vision, and that vision was that someday the following generations would come back to their motherland and be part of something. Later in the moving address, Tiger added that when they come back to the original homelands, they'll be much stronger. His words proved prescient. The occasion for the speech was the beginning of the Okmulgee to Okmulgee bicycle ride. John Beaver, then director of the Creek Cultural Center, and Andrew Lowe, a Vietnam War veteran, cycled from Georgia to Oklahoma, retracing the forced migration of the 1830s. They were assisted along the way by Justin Giles, who drove the support van, and a handful of local cycling enthusiasts joined them on the first leg of their journey. The Okmulgee Indigenous celebration has continued to draw crowds from all over the region, as well as skilled Native dancers and interpreters. The weekend-long affair includes some elements of broader powwow culture, as well as performances specific to the Southeast. In this, it has parallels to events of the 1970s and 1950s highlighted above. Many of the social dances are intended to be intertribal, and guests are invited to join the dancers. Other highlights include stickball demonstrations, food vendors, and honored Muskogee guests, including political leaders, pageant royalty, and the Muskogee Creek Nation Honor Guard. In recent years, the nation has also used the occasion to honor Maconites it holds in high esteem, including National Park Service staff such as Lonnie Davis and Lisa Lemon of the Okmulgee Mounds Association. Muskogee poet Joy Harjo served 3 terms as the Poet Laureate of the United States from 2019 to 2022. She's the first Indigenous person to hold that prestigious post. Over a long and storied career, Harjo has contributed mightily to a wide array of fields, including poetry, music, drama, and memoir. And in February 2020, just prior to the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, she drew huge crowds at Middle Georgia State University and Okmulgee Mounds National Historical Park, where she read poetry and played the flute. Her poetry, particularly the 2019 collection An American Sunrise, touches on themes of deep resonance, of history and homelands, of survival and reckoning and resilience. And her visits to Macon are a forceful reminder of the power of the town's native history. Though I didn't call attention to it, you may have noticed that I switched from Okmulgee National Monument to Okmulgee Mounds National Historical Park in keeping with the upgraded status accorded to the park in 2019. A federal law enacted that year allowed for the quadrupling of the park's size and the pursuit of full national park status, and legislation to make Okmulgee America's newest national park is currently under consideration. None of this would have been possible without the strong partnerships formed by the National Park Service, the Okmulgee Mounds Association, which supports the park, the Okmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, which has been instrumental in the political process, as well as advocacy and land acquisition, Visit Macon, Macon-Bibb County, and most important of all, the Muskogee Nation. The 2022 Okmulgee Indigenous Celebration foreshadowed momentous times for Native American history in Middle Georgia. A huge delegation of Muskogees graced the event with their presence, including dignitaries such as Principal Chief David Hill and Second Chief Del Beaver. Secretary of the Interior Deb Holland, the first Native woman to hold that post, visited and pledged federal support. On a more local level, plans are in the works for a cultural center maintained by the Muskogee Nation and a Bicentennial Park that will do more than just pay lip service to the region's indigenous past. In closing, it's safe to say that the history of Native Americans in Middle Georgia since the arrival of outsiders from Europe centuries ago contains some fairly dark chapters. But the book is still being written, and from where this historian sits, the next chapters look very bright indeed. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Muriel McDowell Jackson, and I'm privileged to be a member of the Macon Bicentennial Committee documenting the first 200 years of the history of Macon-Bibb County. Bibb County was set aside in 1822 because of its access to the Okmulgee River. It was never a part of the original Georgia land lottery system. On the Okmulgee River, this is as far north as you can go for travel with boats and shoals. In December of 1823, the city of Macon was founded, and by 1826, lots in the city were being sold to those adventurous souls strong enough to head to the south. Men from Connecticut like Cimarron Rose and Edward Dorr Tracy, and Virginians like Dr. Ambrose Baber and Thomas Napier. Today, Macon-Bibb is a diverse and multicultural community where the primary ethnicity groups are African Americans, whites, Asians, and Hispanics. The U.S. government defines race as white Americans, European and Middle Eastern, African Americans, American Indians and Alaskan Natives, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. Well, culture is considered a group of people that shares customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation. Ethnicity is another question. An ethnic group or an ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from others. You will note in the list I gave you, there is not a definition for race among our Hispanic brethren. For this reason, the U.S. government has broken it down into two groups. You have Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latinos. Hispanics may report any race and then put whether they're going to be listed as Hispanic or Latino. For those who don't know, Latino encompasses everyone that lives south of North America, that are not necessarily in Spanish-speaking countries, but they live south of United States. These groups have brought their customs with them, different ways of speaking and enabling Macon to become this diverse community. But before all of these groups, there were the indigenous people who had lived here for thousands of years. Legend has the first contact with whites was made by Hernando de Soto in the 1500s and two priests who baptized natives in the Okmulgee River. Because of the encroachment of white settlers into the lands of the indigenous people, Fort Hawkins was built to keep the peace. Not so long after, the remaining Creek Muskogee were forced from their ancient homelands thanks to the numerous treaties that had whittled away their home. I'm focusing on those who were able to assimilate within the Macon culture. One ethnic group that would arrive around 1841 were our Jewish settlers. They have been able to maintain their ethnic cultural identity because of their religious devotion. Macon has both a temple, whose early members were German Jews, and a synagogue whose members consisted of Eastern European and Middle Eastern Jews. Being successful businessmen and women have allowed them to blend into the Anglo-Saxon culture. Many of our Jewish businessmen aided in the survival of our country club during the Depression. When looking at businesses in downtown Macon, you can't help but see names that bring fond memories, such as Dannenberg, Happ Brothers, Putzel Lightning, Yellen's Delicatessen, G. Byrne and Company. The books shown on this screen show how our Jewish citizens have been able to continue their unique burial practices by maintaining separate consecrated cemeteries. Jewish people from other Middle Georgia communities have been brought to Macon for burial. While still working in the Anglo-Saxon community, they have maintained their cultural identity. Another ethnic group that has been very successful are our Greek citizens. Two Greek gentlemen came to Macon and started iconic restaurants that survive today, New Way and Johnny V's. Most people don't realize these businesses were started by immigrants to Macon in the 20th century. The Greek Orthodox Church has allowed this population to maintain close ties to their Greek heritage. Originally commuting to Atlanta for religious services, they have grown and flourished by starting a congregation and purchasing a church. Another way they maintain and embrace their heritage is the Central Georgia Greek Festival, which was started in 2007 and continues today. I will now discuss a few groups that have not been able to assimilate. One of the main groups who was unable to blend in or assimilate were the Chinese. The earliest known Chinese came to Macon in 1881 as laundrymen, a profession that would allow them to earn a living and send money home to their families. But they had strange customs and looked different. In the book Southern Fried Rice, John Young states that people never bothered to know the Chinese as individuals. His father was called Sam Lee because that was the name of the business when he bought it, just like the owner prior to him. They never tried to learn his name or where he came from. They just knew that that's where they would take their laundry. Even children were not immune to discrimination. The Sung sisters came to Macon from China after Methodist missionaries converted their family. The two oldest girls, Chin Ling and A Ling, attended Wesleyan College on College Street. But Mei Ling, the youngest sister and the future Madam Chiang Kai-shek, was unable to enroll in Bibb County schools because, quote, she was not naturalized and not of the Caucasian race. But when she returned to Macon in 1943, she received the red carpet treatment. This community even asked the Jung sisters to greet her to show that they still had a Chinese presence in Macon. In 1956, the Jung family would sell their laundry and move out of Macon, and the title in the article in the Macon News was, "Not a Chinese in our town for the first time in a century." The main ethnic group who came by force rather than by choice were African Americans. Some were freed and some gave themselves freedom. Unfortunately, they were not free to make choices about where they lived or for whom they worked. In spite of these barriers, African Americans have been able to leave their mark on Macon history. Thanks to hard work and business acumen, a thirst for knowledge, and the pursuit of education allowed former enslaved people to move forward when the Civil War ended. Upon freedom, the first things former enslaved males did was vote. They proceeded to create their own society which mimicked the dominant culture and allowed them to reduce their exposure to Jim Crow and segregation. African Americans in Macon created a thriving medical community, doctors, dentists, pharmacies, and hospitals. The Macon Academy of Medicine, Dentistry, and Pharmacy gave these professionals the support they needed to function here in Macon. African Americans managed to purchase property in downtown Macon. The Fraternal Order, the Knights of Pythias, had their state headquarters here in Macon for a time and built what was originally known as the Pythian Temple, later the Mitchell Building. The architect for this building would be a gentleman known as Wallace Rayfield, who was actually born in Macon, raised and got up, went to Pratt Institute and got a degree in architecture. And at the time he designed the building, was working at Tuskegee Institute. This location gave professionals, such as lawyers and realtors, along with the medical profession, a place to work. Cotton Avenue was our Macon's Auburn Avenue. A few of the businesses in the African American community were restaurateurs, florists, bookstore owners, upholsterers. Wherever they were needed, it would be filled. People would train and learn. We also had cobblers. We had real estate Anything you want it to be, you could be, because you had the support of the community and the educational know-how. The Homeosafian Club, also known as the Macon Black Chamber of Commerce, allowed these entrepreneurs to pool their resources and thrive. It gave them a place to come together and discuss any challenges that might have existed within their chosen profession. From the beginning, enslaved people understood the need for education. It would allow them and their children to better themselves. There were individuals, the American Missionary Association, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, along with the Bibb County Board of Education, helped to make educational opportunities possible. Macon African Americans would open a junior college, a secretarial school to teach skills such as typing, and a vocational school to help veterans returning from the military. After working hard, recreation was also a necessity that allowed African American Maconites to rest from their hard work. Places such as Sawyer's Lake, Calhoun's Country Club, and the Dumas Lake allowed exposure to boating, fishing, picnic areas, to name a few of the activities. All of these locations were ran, whether owned by, but ran exclusively for African Americans, so that they were once again shielded from some of the problems you would have with Jim Crow and segregation. Playgrounds were created for children in East Macon and Pleasant Hill. In the 1950s, in response to a number of children drowning in unsupervised waters, the city finally opened Grays Hill Recreation Center. Some of the activities there included a swimming pool where they actually had swim meets for around the people from the state came and participated. Other sports included baseball, archery, football, golf, and Red Cross classes were held there to teach children and adults how to use. Red Cross classes were held there to help people learn CPR and other activities needed. There was even a small petting zoo. Unfortunately, these activities and locations would not last. Urban renewal, which would modernize Macon and in the process wipe out a lot of these accomplishments. Interstate 75 would cut a swath through Pleasant Hill and Grays Hill, destroying Rickydale Shopping Center, which was owned and operated by African Americans. Interstate 16 would adversely affect East Macon, causing the loss of a major community. People and churches were forced to relocate to other parts of the city. In an attempt to capture African American history before those who know are gone, various community groups such as the Macon Arts Alliance, Black Arts Council, the Tuppan Museum, the Booker T. Washington Community Center, Bibb County Schools, the Middle Georgia Historical Society, and the Cotton Avenue Revival Group have worked together to celebrate and document as much as they can. For instance, the 4-hour video series done in 1994, The Cultural and Historical Contributions of African Americans in Macon, Georgia, from 1823 to the present, spoke to a number of individuals who would be considered to be pioneers in their field in the African American community. Along with the Pan-African Festival and the Cotton Avenue Festival, there have been more attempts to include young people and to know their local history. This effort received a major boost in 1983 when Richard Kyle announced his intention to start an African American museum in Macon. Originally known as the Harriet Tubman Historical and Cultural Museum, the Tubman Museum has been responsible for the publications of the 2 books above, Macon's Black Heritage, The Untold Story, and Macon Black and White. Moving from its original location on Walnut Street to its larger quarters on Cherry Street, it has earned a well-known reputation throughout the United States and the world. A new cultural community that is making itself known is the LGBTQIA+ community. It has been in Macon for a number of years, but it's been very well hidden. It seems that the nightclubs we had starting in the late 50s and early 60s, such as the Cherry Street Pub, Landmark, Mark Sellers, Pegasus, Redwood, Topaz, Synergy, We3 Lounge, has served as a place for these individuals to showcase what they believed to be their cultural aspects. And this has also allowed them to slowly reveal themselves to Macon. Younger students of Macon culture have embraced this community and are teaching those of older persuasion that you can be different and still belong to Macon. One of our newest immigrants group is our Hispanic community. With the advent of Hispanic Heritage Month, celebrations are occurring that allow them to share their unique culture from all the various countries, such as Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Cuba, to name a few. We must remember, just because you speak Spanish does not mean you're exclusively from Mexico. The newspaper Que Pasa allows them to retain their language while learning more about our community. Que Pasa also has a radio station, so they're able to get the information to the Spanish-speaking community in a timely fashion. Thanks to cultural activities such as museums and tourism, industry, education, and transportation, More people are coming to Macon-Bibb. We are the fourth largest city in Georgia and to continue to grow as various ethnic groups discover Macon-Bibb County. We are truly becoming a more diverse city.
My name is Lonnie Davis. I'm a retired historian from the National Park Service and also retired military. And I have been tasked to facilitate this event and program with history and dealing with race, ethnicity, and culture. And the three areas I'm going to cover is actually going to be slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. The hereditary system of enslaving people of African descent flourished in Bibb County and Macon until 1865. The outbreak of the Civil War forever changed the future of Macon and Middle Georgia, as well as the American nation. The Civil War began as a struggle to preserve the Union, not as a struggle to free the slaves, but many in the North and the South felt that the conflict would ultimately decide both issues, and it did. Slavery was practiced throughout the province of Georgia in the 17th and 18th century. Initially, when chartered, Georgia was to be slave-free. General Oglethorpe, who was the founder of the colony, imagined a province populated by sturdy farmers who could defend against Spanish aggression. Because of this, the colony's charter prohibits slavery. American slavery, initially the European colonies used Indians and African slaves as well as indentured servants, laborers who promised to work for a contracted number of years. Some Africans arrived in this capacity and were released when their contract expired, but the majority were brought against their will on slave ships. In the 1700s, planters in the southern colonies of North America began to prefer African rather than Indian slaves, because Africans were not as affected by European and tropical diseases as were American Indians, and also African slaves was needed to build a new colony and nation into an economic powerhouse through the production of lucrative crops such as cotton, corn, sugar, cane. By the mid-19th century, Georgia's westward expansion and the abolition movement provoked a great debate over slavery. The ban of slavery was lifted by 1751, and the colony became a royal colony by 1752. After the Revolutionary War, the new United States Constitution tactically acknowledged the institution of slavery, counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of taxation and representation in Congress, and guaranteeing the right to repossess any person held to service or labor, which was basically an obvious understatement for slavery. The ratification of the Constitution of the United States in 1788, slavery became more firmly entrenched than ever in the South. The Constitution counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of taxation and representation in Congress, thus increasing the number of representatives from slave states. This prohibited Congress from abolishing the African slave trade before 1808, which was the Embargo Act, and provided for the return of fugitive slaves to their owner. The city of Macon was officially incorporated by the Act of Georgia legislation December of 1832. On any day, an interesting mixture of people could be seen on the young city's streets: tradesmen, planters, boaters, poor white farmers, slaves, and a few free persons of color. Not all blacks in Middle Georgia were slaves, though. The exceptions composed less than 1% of the total black population. Lucy Craft Laney was one of those. She was born free on April 13, 1854 in Macon, Georgia, 11 years before slavery was abolished by the Constitutional Amendment and after the end of the Civil War. She was the seventh of 10 children born to Louisa and David Laney, free people who were born formerly, both who were formerly enslaved. Her father had saved enough money to buy his freedom and that of his wife about 20 years before Lucy's birth. Georgia, as well as other states, had incorporated the principles of partus sequitum vitrem into law, basically since the colonial period, which basically said that a child would take on the social status of their mother, whether a slave or free. And under this hereditary system of slavery, life was physically and psychologically difficult. William Sanders Scarborough was born on February 16, 1852 in Macon. His father, Jeremiah, was a free man, but his mother was a slave. So therefore, he was a slave. His mother's master, Colonel de Graffenried, provided William and his family a stable home and funded his education, even though it was illegal. Because in 1818, the state of Georgia had made it illegal for a person of color to be taught how to read and write. But this prepared him to serve as president of Wilberforce University, where he served between 1908 and 1920. But William Sanders, referring back to his childhood, he once stated, "My condition was vastly different from most Negro families. I had seen slaves sold. I saw firsthand the cruelty and inhumanity of the slave trade. I could not fathom how people who read the Bible and attend the same church we attended could keep human beings in bondage and treat them so brutally. But few hands toiled from sunup to sundown among cotton, tobacco, corn, and rice. Brutal treatment at the hands of slave holders, however, threatened black family life. Skilled slaves worked as carpenters, blacksmiths, and seamsters. The skilled labor slaves often had more freedom, sometimes being hired out to businesses in cities or on farms where they could earn extra wages. But slavery had resistance, and resistance to slavery came in several forms: rebellions, uprisings, sabotage, work slowdowns, abolition. But most notable form of resistance was the act of running away. Most Americans are familiar with the Underground Railroad in some form or another. The network of gas and safe houses helped thousands of slaves escape to freedom in the North, but not all runaways were organized. Running away also was very dangerous, particularly in the Deep South, fraught with long, uncertain travel, not knowing who to trust, and always the fear of capture. Seeking freedom from slavery sometimes required ingenuity as well as courage, such as that exhibited by the enslaved couple of Ellen and William Craft from Macon. Ellen and William Craft gained notoriety after a daring and very public escape in December of 1848. The daughter of a black woman and her white enslaver, Ellen looked white and was able to dress as a Southern slaveholder in trousers, top hat, and short hair to avoid detection by slave catchers. Her darker-skinned husband, William, accompanied her by masquerading as her attentive valet. But the American Missionary Association from 1820s until the start of the U.S. Civil War were abolitionists that called on the federal government to prohibit slave ownership in the southern states. Religious groups were among the earliest organizations to protest the African slave trade. Although some Quakers were slave holders, overall they were staunch protesters as well as the American Missionary Association. In 1860, the population of Bibb County was listed as 16,289. 679 of those were slaves and free persons of color, and they made up the backbone of King Cotton. There were at least 3 slave depots or slave markets on Poplar Street here in Macon. Slaves worked as skilled craftsmen in construction, factory, and railroad trades, and as servants of wealthy Macon families. The Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, the American Union was broken as brother fought brother in a civil war that remains a defining moment in our nation's history. Its causes and its consequences, including the continuing struggle for civil rights for all Americans, reverberate to this day. From the battlefields to the home front, the cost of the war was steep, its lessons eternal. The toll of more than 1 million casualties, 620,000 of them dead, was far greater than any other war this country has ever fought. The 620,000 dead equated to 2% of the total American population, both North and in the South, in 1861. The U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1862 in July, and on July 17, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln authorized the use of Negroes in the federal service by issuing the Second Confiscation and Militia Act. This act freed slaves whose owners were in rebellion against the United States, and a Militia Act empowered the president to use freed slaves in any capacity in the Army. The U.S. War Department issued General Order Number 143 on May 22, 1863, establishing the Bureau of Colored Troops to facilitate the recruitment of black soldiers to fight for the Union Army. Soon there were 200,000 black soldiers serving in the Union Army and Navy. These men were paid less than white soldiers, were given old and worn uniforms and poor equipment. But one of the staunch abolitionists, who was Frederick Douglass, he had basically stated that the courage displayed by colored troops during the Civil War played an important role in the people of color gaining new rights. He later wrote, "Let the black man get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on earth which they can deny that has earned him the right to citizenship." But the American Missionary Association was a Protestant-based abolitionist group, and their main purpose was the abolition of slavery, education of blacks, the promotion of racial equality, and spreading Christian values. Its members and leaders were both white and black. The association was chiefly sponsored by the Congregationalist Church in New England. The members of the AMA began their support of education for blacks before the Civil War. They recruited teachers for the numerous contraband camps, the United States colored troops and their families that developed into Union-occupied territory in the South during the war. During the Civil War, there was 3 engagements between Union and Confederate forces in the vicinity of Macon. The first was Stoneman's Raid, the second was Kilpatrick's Feint. Both of these engagements was associated with Sherman's March to the Sea. The third and final assault was from the aftermath of Wilson's Raid. Wilson's Raid was primarily to destroy the Confederate arsenal at Selma, Alabama, because the federal government had discovered that the the Confederate Army was now producing a 7-inch rifle cannon. But Selma, Alabama was strategically important as one of the most productive Confederate military facilities remaining in Southern hands in 1865, and this was basically after the Richmond Foundry had fallen. The town contained an arsenal, a Navy foundry, gun factories, a powder mill, military warehouses, and railroad repair shops. After Selma was captured, General Wilson directed the columns be cleared of all the contraband Negroes, and such of the able-bodied ones as were to be able to enlist, to be organized into regiments, one to each of the 3 divisions that he had came south with. These former slaves would be outfitted with muskets in the supply caravan and capture Confederate arms. About the time they arrived in Macon, Wilson's Corps had actually recruited over 2,700 former slaves. On 24 and 25 April in Tatnall Square Park, all of these former slaves recruited by Wilson's Corps and additional former slaves were examined by the surgeon and organized into 3 regiments consisting of 1,100 men each. They were initially outfitted with captured Confederate uniforms and later outfitted with the Union Blue uniform. The American Missionary Association's pace of founding schools and colleges increased during and after the war. Historically, free blacks and white sympathizers alike believed that the education was a priority for the free blacks as well as former slaves. Although the American Missionary Association founded more than 500 schools and colleges for the freedmen of the South during and after the Civil War, spending more money for the purpose than the Freedmen's Bureau of the federal government. Blacks also was granted the right to vote. But most free people saw the Republican Party as their best chance for advancing their claims in partisan politics and became Republicans through local branches of the party and an allied organization, which was the Union League. At its peak, black political mobilization promised not just an improvement in African American life, but a new way of thinking about freedom and equality, with implications for education, public health, the law, and almost every facet of governance. Aided by resources from the Republican Party, black political organizers canvassed the South, educating and registering voters. It was the most democratic movement in American history. From the beginning of Reconstruction, black conventions and newspapers throughout the South had called for the extension of full civil and political rights. Composed of those who had been free from Civil War plus slave ministers, artisans, and Civil War veterans, the black political leadership pressed for the elimination of the racial caste system and economic uplifting of former slaves. 16 African Americans served in the Congress during Reconstruction, including Jefferson Franklin Long in the House, Georgia's lone black congressman of the era. Jefferson Franklin Long of Macon served a brief term in 1870 to 1871, and he gave the first speech by a black representative ever presented before Congress. He spoke against removing restrictions on ex-Confederates holding office. Instead of facing exclusion from legal systems, some black Southerners ran them. Once treated as property, they could now legally own property, and many struggled heroically to do so. Once prohibited from reading, they now built schools and flooded them with teachers and students. Once blocked from the legal protections of marriages, they now registered their unions and claimed their privileges commonly associated with marriage. Nonetheless, Reconstruction soon began to wane. During the 1870s, many Republicans retreated from both the racial equality and the broad definition of federal power spawned by the Civil War. Southern corruption and instability, Reconstruction's critics argued, stemmed from the exclusion of the region's best men, the planters, from power. As Northern Republicans became more conservative, Reconstruction came to symbolize a misguided attempt to uplift the lower class of society. It was not economic dependency, however, but widespread violence coupled with Northern retreat from the idea of equality is what doomed Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan and kindred groups began a campaign of murder, assault, arson that can only be described as a homegrown American terrorism. The 1865 to 1866 Black Codes were an overt manifestation of the system of white supremacy that continued to dominate the American South and ushered in the Jim Crow era. Historians have described this system as the emerged result of a wide variety of laws and practices conducted on all levels of jurisdiction, which main goal was to extort selected social groups. Because legal enforcement depended on so many different local codes, which underwent less scrutiny than statewide legislations, historians today still lack a complete understanding of their full scope. Basically what it was slavery by another name. These three areas that I've talked about is basically what a lot of people classify as touchy subjects. But the only way that we can get past these time in history is to look forward. We can look at them, we can study them, we can talk about them, but the only way we can move forward is to accept our history and move forward with a better light and a better idea. And thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Thelma Dillard. I've been involved with my family in civil rights my entire life. I will share with you years of 1960 through 1970 civil rights I refer to as good trouble. I will start with former Bibb County Commissioner Bert Bivens, Jesse Williams, Reverend J.W. Carner, Michael Howard, Herbert Denard, Joe Gary, and several more were arrested joining the YMCA. The YMCA was closed afterwards and never reopened. Shirley Bivens, my sister, named top the list in a lawsuit, Shirley Bivens versus the Bibb Board of Education, signed by her mother, Hester Bivens, on her behalf. The key figure in the desegregation of Bibb County schools was Hester Bivens, my mother, a single mother of 7 children, 4 of whom played a major role in the integration of Bibb County schools. Bert Bivens III, Shirley Bivens, James Bivens, Larry Bivens. Hester Bivens was referred to as the Rosa Parks of Macon. She, along with her children, including myself, changed Macon. Reverend Dr. Henry Ficklin was the local president of SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, here in Macon. His passion stems from his desire to be a voice for the voiceless. He worked for jobs and voter registration and equal rights for all citizens. Reverend Ficklin served on City Council 28 years. Now he serves as Director of Community Affairs for Mayor Lester Miller's administration. Elaine Lucas was a strong fighter for the rights of African Americans to vote. She fought diligently for voter equality and opportunities. She has served over 20 years on City Council. Now she serves on the County Commission. In the 60s, the first African American girls who integrated were faced with fears of the unknown to break the barriers of a separate and unequal school system in Bibb County. The first African American girls to graduate during the integration at Miller High School in Bibb County in 1965 were Barbara Foster, Elizabeth Jennifer Johnson, Geraldine Mason, Pearlie Matthews, Samaria Ruth Mitchum, Sandra Cornelia Norwood, Maggie Elizabeth Oliver, Vivian Stewart, and Cynthia Worthy. The first African American girls to graduate from McAvoy High School in 1966 were Juanita Shoulders, Marlene Tasker. The first African American girls to graduate during integration from Lassiter High School in Bibb County in 1967 were Bobby Joyce Barnes, Jacqueline Madison, Stacy Sampson. After integration, Lambda Teenage Sorority was founded by yours truly, Thelma Dillard, at Booker T. Washington Center to inspire and encourage academic achievement for African American girls attending integrated schools. African American girls were not welcomed to be included in sororities and other activities. Dr. Dillard became concerned about the girls' morale, academic achievement, and social growth. Therefore, she organized Lambda Local Teenage Sorority. The founding members were Shirley Bivens, Alfreda Thomas, Barbara Williams, Regina Wimberly, Rosalind Woolfolk, Carol Davis, and Annette Williams. On February 9th, Reverends Pascal, Reverend Malone, Reverend Evans, and Reverend Rancifer sat in the front of the bus in Macon and were arrested when they refused to move to the back of the bus. Macon African Americans organized an extremely effective bus boycott against the Bibb Transit Company beginning February 12th. On March 12th, United States District Court Judge William A. Boodle ruled unconstitutional a number of Georgia laws calling for the separate seating of races on buses. By the end of the year, buses, city parks, and public golf courses were desegregated. Boodle also restrained the Bibb Transit Company from enforcing segregated travel. Cartiz Dillard, former NAACP president, 2005, youngest Georgia president, former regional NAACP coordinator, former state NAACP membership chair, was a champion of voter registration and participation. Cartiz Dillard pushed for and implemented increased voter registration that helped lead to higher voter participation. William P. Daddy Bill Randall was the pioneer and leader of the civil rights movement in Macon, Georgia. He served as president of the local branch of the NAACP for several years in the 50s and 60s and led the bus boycott that segregated the Transit Authority. He served as one of the first black county commissioners. Albert Billingsley served as one of the first black county commissioners. He was one of the first blacks to serve on the Macon Water Authority and was a prominent businessman. David Lucas was one of the first African American state legislators from Bibb, serving for over 2 decades. He is presently serving as state senator, District 22, 26, serving for the past 9 years. William Billy Randall was one of the first blacks to serve in the state legislature from Bibb County. He served for 24 years. He served 19 years as chief judge of civil and magistrate court in Bibb County. In the 1960s, Attorney Thomas Jackson served as the attorney for the Macon branch of the NAACP and represented the NAACP in the integration of the Bibb County school system in the case of Shirley Bivens versus Bibb County Board of Education. William Billy Randall served as the first black magistrate judge of Bibb County. In 1963, 21-year-old Bert Bivens III wrote a letter to U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy after being denied entrance into a federally funded vocational training electronics program at White Dudley Hughes, a technical school. With the intervention of the U.S. Department of Justice, Bert Bivens III became the first black to integrate the Bibb County school system. 30 years later, he was elected to the county commission and served until 2020. He served a total of 28 years. Dr. R.J. Jake Martin was brought to Ballard Normal to merge Hudson High School and Ballard Normal High School. Ballard Hudson Senior High School was built in 1949 as the only high school in Macon for African Americans in grades 9 through 12. The school represents the merger of 2 schools, Ballard Hudson High School, a private school with roots in Lewis High School, established in 1868 by the American Missionary Association, and Hudson High School, a public industrial high school. In 1970, the same year, a federal court required the integration of all public schools in Georgia. Ballard Hudson High School was reorganized and renamed.
Hello, I'm John Marson Dunaway, and I'm reporting on Maconites who have contributed to Beloved Community. I titled it this way because in 2005, we started a Beloved Community Symposium at Mercer, and that's what started me on my journey toward racial reconciliation. Let's start with Ballard Normal School in Pleasant Hill. This was a seedbed of pioneering African American education, not only in Macon or Georgia, but throughout the U.S., really. It provided a large percentage of the black teachers throughout the state. It also produced a number of barrier breakers, including future college presidents and scholars, as well as high achievers in medicine, architecture, and business. It was first organized in 1865 as Lewis High School by the American Missionary Society, an arm of the Congregational Church. It moved into this building in 1887 and became Ballard Normal in honor of Stephen Ballard, a successful Brooklyn businessman who provided funding for its construction. Lucy Craft Laney was a pioneer educator and civil rights activist. She graduated from Ballard Lewis in 1869 and was admitted to the very first class of Atlanta University. After 10 years of teaching in several Georgia towns, she opened her own school in Augusta. She was one of the first black Georgians to have her portrait hung in the state capitol. She also was one of the founders of the NAACP. She most likely adopted the middle name in honor of Ellen Craft, co-author of a well-known slave narrative telling of her escape from slavery in Macon in 1848 with the help of the Underground Railroad network. John Oliver Killens grew up in Pleasant Hill, and he graduated from Ballard in 1933. He became a well-known writer in New York, where he was very active in the Harlem Renaissance. His first novel, Youngblood, 1954, is a fictionalized account of growing up in Pleasant Hill. He also was author of plays and screenplays and taught creative writing at a number of colleges. Penn State scholar Keith Gilliard wrote his biography, which is titled John Oliver Killens, A Life of Literary Activism. Judge William Augustus Bootle was a triple bear, earning his bachelor's and law degrees and being awarded an honorary doctorate from Mercer. Following law school, he practiced law in Macon and was nominated by President Eisenhower as judge in the Middle Georgia District Court. As chief judge of that court in 1961, he ordered the desegregation of the University of Georgia, requiring the admission of Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter. Following his ruling, he was hanged in effigy multiple times and received innumerable death threats. In 1998, the federal courthouse in Macon was named for him. Sergeant Rodney M. Davis grew up in Pleasant Hill also. After graduating from Peter G. Appling High School in 1961, he joined the Marine Corps. In 1967, he was sent to Vietnam as a platoon guide with the rank of sergeant. During Operation Swift, his platoon was attacked by a large North Vietnamese force, and elements of the platoon were pinned down in a trench line by incoming mortar rounds, heavy automatic, and small arms fire. He went from man to man, encouraging them to fight on while returning fire at the same time. When an enemy hand grenade fell in the trenches where his men were fighting, without hesitation, he threw himself on the grenade. Every comrade in arms he saved was white. A U.S. Navy guided missile frigate was named in his honor. Some of his Marine buddies raised over $60,000 to erect this granite monument on his grave in Linwood Cemetery. Sam Oney was born in Nigeria and came to Macon from Ghana in 1963, the first black student on the Mercer campus. A courageous pioneer for racial equality, he endured repeated insults with great dignity. His persecution culminated in being denied access to the sanctuary of Tapnell Square Baptist Church, which in those days was on the Mercer campus. He was handcuffed and escorted from the church by local police. After this faith-shattering experience, Oney vowed never to return to Georgia. He earned a master's degree from Berkeley, and he worked with Andrew Young in an NGO focused on rural development in Africa. In 2014, he was the keynote speaker at the Beloved Community Symposium. He had returned in 1993 when President Godse invited him to speak at Founders Day. Sam Oney has graced us with his presence at all 17 of the Beloved Community Symposiums. Sam's contributions to Mercer will never be forgotten. His portrait now hangs in the W.G. Lee Alumni House, and a scholarship has been set up in his name. Dr. C.T. Vivian was not a Maconite, I'm sort of fudging here, but the civil rights icon did come to Macon in 2016 as the keynote speaker for the Beloved Community Symposium. He is shown here with Sam Oney and in the next slide with other pastors as well as Mercer President Bill Underwood. Professor Joe Hendricks he graduated from Mercer in 1955. He was a faculty member and administrator for over 40 years at Mercer, and he was a key figure in bringing ceremony to campus. And throughout his career, he worked to advocate for racial justice, both at Mercer and in the Macon community with friends such as William P. Randall. Students and colleagues alike referred to him as Papa Joe. And over the past half century, he was undoubtedly the most beloved faculty member on campus. Reverend Dr. Lonzie F. Edwards Sr. was a multi-talented leader in our community. Growing up in a single-parent family in Hancock County, he earned degrees from Knoxville College, Yale, Duke, and Emory. Pastor of Mount Moriah Baptist Church, where he invited the community at large for conversations on racial reconciliation. He was also a civil rights attorney, entrepreneur, county commissioner, and author of several books. Lonzie became my mentor in the beloved community work from the very beginning. He was a dear, loyal friend who was taken from us all too early. Finally, Macon griots. This slide shows us 3 of the many African Americans who have adopted the role of griot, which is an African word for a storyteller or poet or singer who keeps alive the heritage of a traditional culture. Dr. Thomas Duval is a retired dentist whose family came to Macon in the 1870s. He works to cancel the pipeline to prison by telling stories of African American heroes to black school children in creative ways that motivate them to read and excel in education. Muriel Jackson, on the right-hand side, directs the archives and genealogy room of Washington Memorial Library, and she is a walking encyclopedia of local African American history. And finally, Julia Ellen Craft Davis on your left on the screen. Although, again, she's not a Maconite, she did give a lecture here in 2015, and she continues to keep alive the memory of her great-great-great-grandparents, William and Ellen Craft, the authors of a well-known slave narrative that tells of their daring escape from slavery in Macon in 1848. She lives in Charleston, where William and Ellen Craft were buried. Thank you.